John George lay stretched in a broken Japanese pillbox on the slopes near Point Cruz. The January air clung like wet cloth. At first light, the moisture hung low over the ravines. The jagged wreckage of coconut trunks, rotting sacks of rice, and splintered bamboo told of months of shelling. He had been told the night before that 11 Japanese snipers haunted these trees and that the battalion had lost 14 men to invisible bullets in 3 days. He was 27 years old and a state rifle champion from Illinois. Yet the war had not given him a single confirmed kill. Around him, his fellow officers whispered that his bolt-action rifle was a toy ordered through the mail, and that when the Japanese started firing, he would wish for a Garand. He pressed his cheek to the smooth walnut stock and peered through a 2.5 times scope at a world of tangled limbs and fronds. Somewhere above him, eyes watched from high banyan branches. There was no breeze. A leaf moved. A slight angle of shadow became a head and shoulders. He exhaled, squeezed, and sent his first round upward. A body tumbled from 90 feet and crashed through the undergrowth. That first shot broke the spell that had kept his company pinned down. If he had hesitated, those trees would have kept claiming men. The story begins long before George crouched in a steaming bunker. Born in 1915, he grew up in Illinois and learned to shoot as soon as he could handle a .22. He joined the State National Guard and embraced competitive marksmanship. By his mid-20s, he was the youngest person ever to win the Illinois 1,000-yard championship. On weekends, he drove out to ranges where men measured themselves by hits on distant targets and notched scores by the light of the setting sun. He learned to read mirage and wind and to work iron sights out to 1,000 yards. He was meticulous about trigger squeeze and follow-through and kept a notebook with sketches of targets. This discipline and patience would later mean survival in a jungle. On the eve of war, he looked at the weapons issued by the U.S. Army. The service rifle was the semi-automatic M1 Garand. It held 8 rounds in a clip and allowed rapid follow-up shots, and he admired it. He also believed that in certain conditions, a bolt action with a good scope offered more precision. He saved his money and ordered a Winchester Model 70 sporting rifle through a mail-order catalog. He chose the heavy barrel in .306 and fitted it with a Lyman Alaskan 2.5 times scope. It arrived in a long wooden crate with the word "fragile" stenciled on it. He zeroed it at 200 yards and practiced with it on paper and steel. He intended to carry it into war, even though the Army saw no use for commercial rifles. When he reported to his unit in 1941, his rifle remained delayed in the United States due to paperwork. He boarded a ship without it. During early 1942, he trained with the 132nd Infantry Regiment, part of the Americall Division. The Americall had been formed from National Guard units and would relieve Marines on Guadalcanal. As his regiment shipped out, he was issued an M1 Garand. He respected the semi-auto's firepower, yet he asked to have his personal rifle sent forward when it arrived. Others found humor in his insistence. One officer called it a deer rifle unfit for Pacific jungles. Another referred to it as a mail-order sweetheart. The standard view was that in close jungle fighting you needed a fast semi-automatic rather than a long, heavy bolt action with a scope. George listened but did not yield. He thought of the tall palms and deep ravines he had read about and imagined that there would be times when hitting a small target at 200 yards would save more lives than pumping 8 rounds into bushes. Guadalcanal was not the campaign he had envisioned. When the 132nd landed in late 1942, they relieved exhausted Marines who had fought for months to hold Henderson Field. The island was a study in contrasts. Along the coastal plain, the airstrips sat on open ground, but inland the mountains were covered with dense jungle. Mount Austin loomed to the south. The National World War II Museum describes the slopes as covered in huge tropical trees with buttress roots and dense undergrowth that limited visibility to a few feet. Japanese forces dug into a stronghold known as the Gifu. Hidden bunkers, tunnels, and interlocking fields of fire made it costly to approach. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 132nd lost 34 men killed and 279 wounded in assaults on those positions. In that environment, Japanese snipers used the jungle as a fortress. An intelligence report from the period notes that they often climbed palm or banyan trees, hid among coconuts or fronds, and were extremely difficult to detect until they fired. They targeted officers and NCOs, knowing that decapitation of leadership would slow American units. The fear of invisible bullets from above gnawed at the men filling canteens and carrying supplies. For weeks after landing, George fought the war like any other infantry officer. He led patrols, directed his squad's fire, and relied on his Garand. The mountains swallowed men. Casualties mounted in the mud. By late December, his personal Winchester finally arrived in a crate covered with dust and shipping labels. He opened it under a palm tree. The rifle was oiled and wrapped in wax paper. Men gathered around to laugh and shake their heads. "A dear gun," one said. Another asked why he would carry something slower than the M1. George simply nodded. He mounted the scope and cleaned the barrel. He spent an afternoon in a clearing checking the zero at 100 yards. When he wrote about this later, he said he heard the murmurs and realized that if his rifle did not deliver, he would be responsible not only for his pride but for his men. The Gifu stronghold was taken only after heavy bombardment and flanking maneuvers. As the 132nd pushed past Point Cruz, a ridge overlooking the coastal plain, Japanese snipers began to exact a toll. They were elite soldiers, trained to climb high into banyan trees, anchor themselves with ropes, and wait for days. They carried little food and covered their helmets and shoulders with leaves. Often they cut a coconut in half and peered through holes drilled into it. When Americans moved along a trail or stooped to fill water cans, a shot cracked. Men fell. The survivors hit the dirt and sprayed the canopy with automatic fire. Most of the time, they hit nothing. The intelligence report warns that bullets zip down from heights and that some snipers used cuttings to camouflage themselves. After each shot, they froze or moved along a branch to another position. They were seldom found. By early January, the 132nd had lost 14 men in 72 hours along a single stretch near Point Cruz. Morales ad. Officers ordered patrols to stay undercover. Men whispered about the ghosts in the trees. John George was summoned to a makeshift command post. The battalion commander, who had earlier dismissed his rifle, looked weary. He told George that the snipers were killing men and that conventional search parties were failing. He wanted to know whether the mail-order rifle could do more than punch paper. George told him it could if he were given freedom to hunt. He was assigned a small team of spotters and told to remove the threat. He recorded later that he felt the weight of expectation and the cold skepticism of peers. He chose the ruins of a Japanese bunker as his first hide. The structure was a lattice of logs and coral with a view of the hillside and the high branches of banyan and palm. At dawn, he settled in with his rifle and binoculars. The humidity seemed to slow time. In training, he had shot at targets that waited motionless for him. Now the targets were eyes and fingers somewhere above. He scanned slowly and deliberately. The 2.5 times scope was not ideal for long range, but it offered clarity and a wide field of view. Leaves glistened. Monkeys shrieked. Nothing moved. Hours passed. Then he saw it. A subtle swaying of a palm frond when there was no wind. He focused on the area and detected a darker shape behind the leaves. It might have been a clump of vegetation, or it could have been the barrel of a rifle. He anchored his elbow into the dirt, exhaled, and touched the trigger. The Winchester kicked against his shoulder. A single shot cracked and echoed through the ravine. A human shape fell from the crown of the tree and bounced off branches before it landed in the brush. George had never seen a man fall from 90 feet. It was a hideous arc, the weight and mass of a body twisting in midair. He chambered another round and swept the canopy. One sniper down. He saw movement on an adjacent branch. The partner who had been spotting was shifting. George fired again. A second body crashed through vines. 2 kills in seconds. He heard men behind him gasp. Someone whispered that maybe the deer rifle could hunt other game. He remained in that bunker for hours, watching. The Japanese were not amateurs. They knew that one sniper seldom operated alone. When one fired, another observed for muzzle flashes of returning fire. Now they must have realized that an American with a scope had entered the field. He could feel the eyes scanning for him. He did not stay in one spot. As soon as he killed the second sniper, he slid backward into a shadow. Minutes later, the explosion of mortar shells shook the bunker. The Japanese had triangulated his previous position and opened with 81mm and 90mm mortars. The first rounds walked up the slope. Splinters and coral flew. George clutched his rifle and crawled through the dirt to a shell hole half filled with rainwater. He waded into the pool until the water came to his chest. The cold took his breath away. He submerged his rifle except for the scope and listened as rounds cratered the pillbox he had just left. If he had stayed, he would have been blown apart. When the barrage stopped, he slithered back to a new hide. Over the next hours, he played a deadly game of observation and concealment. Japanese sniper teams attempted to draw him by sending a decoy into a slightly exposed position. From another angle, a true sniper would watch for the shot and then fire at the muzzle flash. George recognized the ploy. He located the decoy on a lower branch and realized that behind him, higher and deeper in the tree, a second sniper lay prone on a limb with a perfect field of fire. He decided to break the pattern. He fired at the decoy without exposing his own muzzle by shooting from within the dark of the bunker, then immediately shifted and fired at the higher branch before the second sniper could react. 2 figures fell. The jungle was silent except for the drip of water and the hiss of insects. As the day turned to evening, he had killed 4 Japanese snipers. At dusk, rain began to fall in sheets. The downpour masked movement and amplified the sound of frogs. He crawled to the shell hole again, submerged to his neck, and waited. He could not wipe water from a scope or his eyes. A Japanese patrol moved along the trail below him, following footprints. He could see their silhouettes through the curtain of rain. One man paused at the edge of his crater and peered in. Their eyes met through the filthy water. George raised the rifle and fired from the hip. The muzzle blast underwater deafened him and sent a plume of mud and water into the air. The Japanese soldier crumpled backward. The others fired wildly into the jungle and withdrew. George stayed motionless until their footsteps disappeared. Day 2 began with a new plan. He moved to another part of the ridge, where he could look into a grove of banyan trees that had yet to be targeted. He lay in a depression of roots. The sun rose and burned off the mist. The humidity made sweat drip from his chin onto the stock. He waited. Hours passed. He began to wonder whether the Japanese had pulled back. Then he saw a glint, sunlight reflected off metal high in a tree. He counted the limbs and estimated the height at nearly 300 yards away. He dialed the scope slightly high, remembering the bullets drop at that distance. He aimed not at the reflection, but at a darker shape behind it. His shot cracked and the glint disappeared. He saw a cascade of leaves. Another sniper had been removed. This distance was long for his scope, but the heavy barrel and his training made it possible. He killed another 2 that day, bringing the total to 7. Each time he repositioned after firing, crawling through mud and roots to avoid counterfire and mortars. On the 3rd day, the Japanese changed tactics. They used twin snipers separated by dozens of yards, hoping that the survivor would identify the American's position. He anticipated this and used the environment. He found a position behind a fallen tree trunk with vines draped over it. He observed a pair of snipers almost 300 yards away. One was low, almost halfway down the trunk, to tempt him. The second was high. He shot the high sniper first. The low one panicked and looked around. He shot him as well. The Japanese shelled his vicinity. He rolled down a slope, slid through brush, and came up in a gully. He counted 8 kills by mid-morning. By this time, his presence was known. The Japanese commanders ordered a concerted hunt. George wrote later that he could hear voices, the crack of bamboo, and the soft pad of bare feet on wet leaves. He stayed ahead of them by moving after each shot. At one point, he hid under a fallen palm, whose trunk had rotted into a hollow tunnel. He lay inside like a worm, his rifle angled upward through a knothole. He watched the canopy through a pinhole of light. It took an hour for the next sniper to show himself. When he did, George's shot knocked him backward off his perch. Mortar shells bracketed the palm. Splinters fell around his face. He coughed through dust and rolled out, slipping down a ravine into thorn bushes. He crawled on hands and knees until he reached a small stream. There he waited until dusk, his body covered in mud and insect bites. On the 4th day, he decided to finish the job. Only 3 snipers remained by his count. He rose at first light and climbed a slope under cover of darkness. From a shallow depression, he could see 3 tall palms separated by 20 yards. He suspected that each held a sniper. He decided to attack systematically. He fired 1 shot at the left tree and saw nothing fall. He waited. 10 minutes later, he saw a slight ripple near the middle tree. He fired. A body came loose and swung on a rope before dropping. The remaining sniper in the 3rd tree fired. The bullet snapped a leaf inches from his ear. He flinched, then steadied, and aimed at where he thought the muzzle flash had come from. He squeezed and watched as a shape slumped forward and then slid downward. He breathed and chambered another round. Silence. He had killed all 3. In 4 days, he had eliminated 11 Japanese snipers. He had fired fewer than 20 rounds. Every shot had been deliberate. His rifle was no longer a subject of jokes. The men around him looked at him with a mixture of relief and respect. The battalion commander shook his hand. The mail-order Deer rifle had saved the company. News of his success spread. Commanders who had scoffed at the idea of sport rifles now asked whether more could be obtained. George insisted that precision shooting was not about hardware alone. It required training, patience, and an understanding of the environment. He was ordered to form a small sniper section. He selected 40 of the best shots from the regiment and began to train them in the fundamentals of marksmanship. They used Springfield rifles fitted with thunderable scopes. He paired each sniper with a spotter. He taught them to control breathing, to squeeze the trigger without jerking, to read wind by watching grass and leaves, to use any available cover, and to plan escape routes. He stressed that a sniper was an intelligence asset as well as a killer. They learned to observe patterns, count enemy movements, and report. The first operations of this new section resulted in the deaths of several Japanese officers and machine gunners. The Japanese began to fear that any movement above ground could be met with a hidden bullet. Beyond the tactical success, the episode forced a re-evaluation of doctrine. Until then, the Army had assumed that masked riflemen with semi-automatics were sufficient in the jungle. George's demonstration showed that in terrain where lines of sight were limited, a single well-placed round could matter more than 8 fast shots. His men continued to use their M1 Garands for general firefights, but they also carried scoped rifles for situations that required reach and precision. George never disparaged the standard rifle. In fact, in later writings, he called the M1 Garand the best rifle of the war and said it gave the infantryman his perfect weapon. He noted that the Springfield, once the pride of the Army, was obsolete. He believed that semi-automatic rifles turned the tide of battle. His experience on Guadalcanal did not contradict this. It simply showed that there are moments when an individual marksman can shift the balance when he is allowed to apply his skill. For a time after the Point Cruz duel, his company saw fewer sniper casualties. The Japanese continued to fight fiercely, but they could no longer rely on treetop sharpshooters along that ridge. The 132nd slowly advanced along the northern coast. George continued to carry his Winchester along with his Garand. He used it to pick off machine gunners and officers at distances beyond the reach of most rifles. He also learned to respect Japanese weapons. In his book, he wrote that the Type 96 light machine gun, firing 6.5mm rounds, was superior to the American bar in the jungle because it was lighter and more controllable. He praised the Japanese sniper rifles for their smooth bolt operation. He admired the enemy's discipline. These were professional soldiers who fought with courage and skill. The fact that he killed 11 of them did not diminish his respect for them. In February, he was wounded by shrapnel while directing mortar fire. The wound was not severe, but it took him out of frontline service for weeks. By the time he returned, the Guadalcanal campaign had ended. The Americall Division moved to Fiji and then to the Russell Islands. George's reputation as a marksman preceded him. He was asked to give lectures on sniping and to help other units develop programs, but he found he had little patience for bureaucracy. He missed the intensity of combat. In mid-1943, he volunteered for a new unit being formed for long-range penetration operations in Burma. Its code name was Galahad. The men would later be known as Merrill's Marauders. The Marauders were assembled under the command of Brigadier General Frank Merrill. Composed mostly of volunteers, the 5,307 Composite Unit was designed to infiltrate deep behind Japanese lines in Burma and disrupt supply routes. The mission involved weeks of marching through some of the world's most difficult jungle. According to later histories, the Marauders advanced 750 miles in 5 months, fought 5 major engagements and 32 separate battles, and endured hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Each man received a Bronze Star. George joined as an intelligence officer and marksmanship trainer. He brought his Winchester, but he knew that this war would be different. In India, he trained with British Chindits and learned about long-range patrols. The equipment he carried was reduced to essentials: a lightweight pack, rations, medical supplies, and a rifle. Many Marauders carried M1 carbines, which George admired for their light weight, moderate power, and accuracy at 200 yards. He called the carbine an ace weapon. He still preferred the Garand for its stopping power and reliability. He left the Winchester behind on many marches because the thick undergrowth of Burma limited visibility to 50 yards. In these conditions, a scoped rifle offered little advantage. The enemy could be heard before he was seen. Most firefights occurred at 30 to 50 yards in swirling bamboo and elephant grass. He later wrote that the Marauder's life was shooting and marching and marching and shooting. The differences between Guadalcanal and Burma were stark. On Guadalcanal, the enemy had fixed positions and used treetop snipers. In Burma, both sides prowled like cats. Ambushes were sprung at 20 yards with automatic weapons. The heat and disease took a greater toll than bullets. Men suffered from malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. They ate meager rations and drank from stagnant streams. Leeches clung to their legs. They slept in the rain and woke covered in mildew. The long columns moved through gorges and over ridges, often carrying wounded comrades for miles. George's role was to help find enemy trails, to select ambush sites, and to coordinate fires. He used his Winchester only when he could see an officer or machine gun crew at a distance. These shots were rare but decisive. He also used captured Japanese weapons when ammunition for his rifle ran low. He became a student of enemy equipment. He respected the Type 96 light machine gun for its reliability and ease of control. He wrote that the Japanese used their mortars with great skill and that their mountain artillery was deadly accurate. In March 1940, the Marauders launched an attack on the Japanese base at Myitkyina. It required crossing mountains and jungles. The unit was reduced to half strength by disease, yet it marched on. George's account describes men collapsing, being carried on makeshift litters, then returning to the ranks when they recovered. At Myitkyina, the Marauders captured the airfield after a bitter fight. They held it for weeks against counterattacks until relieved. Of the original 3,000 who had set out, fewer than 200 were fit for duty at the end. George had lost weight, suffered from jungle ulcers, and carried scars from leeches and thorns. He had proven that an individual marksman could still find targets, but he had also learned that industrial war consumed men by the thousands. He understood that his rifle was a tool, not a talisman. When he returned to the United States in late 1944, he was a different man. He had been in continuous combat for 2 years. He had seen his friends buried in muddy graves and had killed men he never met. He used his leave to marry his sweetheart and to visit the families of comrades. After the war ended, he mustered out in 1947 and resumed his education. He enrolled at Princeton University and graduated with highest honors, winning the Atwater Prize for Politics. He studied at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. He traveled to East Africa and became a big game hunter and writer. He worked as a director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the Foreign Affairs Institute in Washington and specialized in African affairs. He also wrote a book about his wartime experiences, titled Shots Fired in Anger. It is both a memoir and a manual. In it, he recounts his time in the Pacific without glorifying himself. He analyzes weapons and tactics with an engineer's eye. He praises the M1 Garand as the infantryman's perfect weapon and calls the M1 carbine an ace weapon. He criticizes the Springfield as obsolete and the Johnson rifle as unreliable. He writes about the importance of reading wind, maintaining equipment, and caring for one's feet. He describes the courage of Japanese soldiers and the skill of their marksmen. He notes that Japanese snipers used palm trees and coconuts for concealment and that they targeted officers. He shares the story of point crews not to boast but to illustrate the value of patience, observation, and calm triggers. The book became a classic among shooters and historians. George lived a full life after the war. He married Dorothea, with whom he shared decades of travel and writing. He wrote articles on big game hunting and African politics. He advised government agencies on foreign affairs. He remained a student of firearms and ballistics. He died in 2009 at the age of 94. His passing was noted quietly. There were obituaries in military magazines and on forums for shooters. Those who knew him recalled his calm demeanor, his dry humor, and his insistence on precision. He never sought recognition. He considered himself one among many. His rifle, the Winchester Model 70 that he had ordered by mail in 1941, now rests in a museum. It lies in a glass case under soft light. To most visitors, it looks like a hunting rifle with its wooden stock, bolt handle, and modest scope. They do not know that this piece of wood and steel once halted a series of killings on a tropical island. They do not know that it forced an army to rethink its disdain for individual marksmanship. They walk past, unaware that the rifle changed tactics and saved lives. He did not emerge from childhood with a rifle in his hands by accident. His father taught him the basics of marksmanship on a farm outside Bloomington. They shot tin cans off fence posts and learned to squeeze the trigger without moving the barrel. By the time he was 14, he could shoot crows from the top of a barn. He experimented with different loads, using his allowance to buy .22 cartridges. As he grew older, he graduated to the Springfield and spent afternoons lying in tall grass, counting breaths and waiting for the wind to settle. His love of ballistics came from reading magazines and from tinkering with hand-loaded ammunition. He kept careful notes on muzzle velocity and bullet drop. He built his own shooting bench and a set of wind flags from old shirts. He treated shooting as a craft that required study and persistence. The decision to buy the Winchester was not impulsive. George pored over catalogs and correspondence. He studied the specifications of the Model 70, noting the heavy barrel and the Mauser-style action. He wrote letters to the manufacturer asking about barrel twist rates and to Lyman about the parallax of their scopes. He saved part of his National Guard pay for months. He remembered walking to the post office with a money order and feeling a rush of excitement. Weeks later, a crate arrived at his parents' house. He pried open the lid and was greeted by the smell of cosmoline. The rifle's walnut stock gleamed. He lifted it out of the packing paper and worked the bolt. It slid like glass. He mounted the Lyman Alaskan scope himself, using care to align the crosshairs. He zeroed the rifle on a patch of open prairie. Each shot was like a promise that someday he would use it for something important. He practiced with that rifle not just at the usual 100 yards, but out to 600 and beyond. He learned to judge wind by the way leaves fluttered and by the shimmer of heat over grass. At ranges, he competed against older men who admired his precision. He became the youngest person to win the Illinois 1,000-yard championship. He attributed his success not to natural talent alone, but to hours of dry firing, to logging every shot in a notebook, and to the calm mind he cultivated when lying prone for long periods. He tested different loads, weighed powder on a scale, and seeded bullets to the perfect depth. He found that small differences in ammunition could shift a shot inches at long range. These lessons would carry over to the jungle, when he would have to allow for humidity, temperature, and angle. Before the war, he compared the M1 Garand and the Springfield with the Model 70. He respected the semi-automatic for its speed and the Springfield for its ruggedness. He studied the design of the gas system on the M1 and appreciated the reliability of its end-block clip. Yet he knew that mass production and standardization came at the cost of barrel finish and trigger quality. His own rifle's bolt throw and smooth trigger were luxuries. He weighed the advantages of a 5-round bolt action against an 8-round semi-automatic. He understood that he would need to pick his shots carefully if he were to make the most of his weapon. When he arrived in the Pacific and was issued an M1, he did not complain. He used it with enthusiasm, praising its ability to deliver rapid, accurate fire. But he still looked forward to the day his Winchester would arrive. When the sniper section was formed, George drew on his experience, not only as a shooter, but as a competitor and coach. He designed drills where soldiers had to crawl long distances, then take a shot with a pounding heartbeat. He hid targets in trees and timed how long it took students to find them. He made them keep observation logs, recording everything they saw and heard. He had them pair off and practice communication, using whispered signals to coordinate shots. He insisted that they alternate roles so that each man understood both shooting and spotting. He taught them to judge distance by measuring the size of a human figure through a scope. He also emphasized camouflage. He showed them how to construct ghillie suits from burlap and vegetation. He led by example, crawling through mud alongside them and staying awake during night watches. The early missions of the sniper section were a mix of success and loss. On one patrol, they ambushed a Japanese courier carrying messages to a command post. The single shot saved dozens of lives. On another mission, they targeted a machine gun crew that pinned down a platoon. Their bullet cut down the gunner, and the rest of the Japanese withdrew. There were days when they fired only one round. Their restraint frustrated some commanders who wanted more aggressive action, but George insisted that the value of snipers lay in precision, not volume. The section lost 2 men to counter-sniping. One was hit while adjusting his position. The other was killed while observing through binoculars. Their funerals were quiet affairs in the jungle. George wrote their names in his notebook and felt the weight of their absence. His evaluations of weapons became required reading in training manuals. He dissected Japanese rifles and machine guns. He noted that the Type 38 and Type 99 rifles had bolts that opened smoothly and were easy to work quietly. He criticized their sights for being poorly calibrated, but praised the quality of their barrels. He compared the trajectory of the 7.7mm cartridge to the .3006. He explained why the M1903 Springfield's 2-stage trigger could be both a blessing and a curse. He wrote that the Johnson rifle, while innovative, had a tendency to jam when dirty. He described the limitations of submachine guns in jungle fighting and advocated for the M1 carbine's balance of weight and power. His analyses were technical yet readable. They stemmed from first-hand use in combat rather than theory. Training with the Chindits in India opened his eyes to another style of warfare. The British had been fighting in Burma since 1942 and had developed their own doctrines for long-range penetration. They taught him how to cross rivers silently using inflated rubber bags. They showed him how to set ambushes in elephant grass and how to signal with bird calls. He learned to respect local scouts who could navigate by the feel of the ground. He studied Burmese language basics to communicate with porters. He experienced the camaraderie of a multinational force composed of Americans, British, Burmese, and Chinese. He noted in his journal that the Chindits valued individual initiative and adaptability as much as firepower. These lessons influenced how he later trained American troops. The marches in Burma were beyond anything he had experienced on Guadalcanal. The marauders carried 70-pound packs over ridges and through swamps. They waded through knee-deep mud for hours. They crossed rivers at night on rickety rafts, holding their weapons above their heads. Many suffered from trench foot, their skin sloughing off from constant wetness. Leeches swarmed in the water, attaching themselves in tender places. Malaria flared up again and again. Men who refused to fall out sometimes had to be physically restrained for their own safety. George took his turn carrying the heavy radio when the radio man collapsed. He learned that leadership meant sharing the load. He also learned that morale depended on small rituals, like boiling tea or sharing letters from home. In this way, the unit kept moving even when bodies rebelled. Though the Winchester stayed behind on many patrols, there were moments in Burma when George used it to dramatic effect. Near the village of Shaduzup, he spotted a Japanese officer directing traffic on a distant road. The range was around 400 yards, beyond the effective range of most rifles in the jungle. He crawled to a rise, aligned his crosshairs, and fired. The officer dropped, and confusion ensued among the troops on the road. Later, during the battle for Myitkyina, he saw a machine gun nest across a paddy field, too far for grenades or small arms. He used a Model 70 to take out the gunner, and then the assistant. The gun fell silent. These shots did not turn battles, but they reduced casualties. Each long-range hit reminded him of his days on Illinois ranges and his duel on Guadalcanal. Jungle warfare created tensions beyond the enemy. The noises at night included not just insects, but the roars of distant tigers and the trumpeting of elephants. Allied forces relied on Burmese guides who moved like ghosts through the forest. Sometimes these guides were suspected of switching allegiances. Friendly fire incidents occurred when units mistook each other for Japanese patrols. Navigational errors led columns into Japanese ambushes or into swamps. George wrote about one night when his unit followed a compass bearing for hours only to realize they had been walking in a circle due to iron deposits in the soil. The sense of disorientation was constant. Maps were often inadequate. Radios failed in the humidity. Survival depended on ingenuity and trust in fellow soldiers. After the war, adjusting to civilian life required effort. George sometimes woke sweating, hearing mortars in his dreams. He found solace in returning to the range. The act of lining up a sight picture and squeezing the trigger calmed him. He connected with other veterans through shooting clubs. He wrote articles not only about tactics, but also about the value of marksmanship as a mental discipline. He cautioned hunters against taking sloppy shots. He spoke at small town halls about the need for the military to invest in basic shooting skills. He corresponded with active duty soldiers and offered advice. He never mentioned his number of kills. Instead, he emphasized learning and improvement. Shooting remained part of his identity, but it was no longer about war. It was about maintaining mastery and focus. At Princeton and Oxford, he approached his studies with the same diligence he had applied to marksmanship. He read voraciously and wrote long papers on colonial history. He argued that understanding local cultures was crucial for foreign policy. Drawing on his experiences in the Pacific and Africa, he joined discussion groups and listened more than he spoke. He visited art museums and saw displays of weapons from past centuries. The juxtaposition of beauty and violence intrigued him. He thought of his own rifle and wondered if one day it would sit behind glass, stripped of context. He recognized that objects become symbols. A rifle that once was a lifeline becomes a curiosity for schoolchildren. Hunting in Africa rekindled some of the sensations of wartime without the moral burden. He tracked antelope through tall grass, reading spoor and watching for subtle movements. He felt his heart quicken as he lined up a shot, then relax after he fired. He took no pleasure in killing for its own sake. He wrote about the ethics of hunting and the need to conserve wildlife. He saw parallels between stalking animals and stalking enemy soldiers. Both required patience, knowledge of the environment, and respect for the quarry. Yet the stakes were different. In war, failure meant death for oneself or a comrade. In hunting, it meant going home empty-handed. This distinction allowed him to enjoy the challenge without the anxiety. His family life provided an anchor. Dorothea listened to his stories without judgment. They hosted dinners where friends would ask about the war. He would answer honestly but briefly, then change the subject. He built a small workshop in his garage where he reloaded ammunition and repaired rifles. He taught his children to shoot, but he insisted on strict safety procedures. He kept his rifles locked in a cabinet. He explained that firearms were tools requiring respect. When his children were older, he told them about Guadalcanal and Burma. He stressed the importance of doing one's duty even when others scoff. He emphasized the need to think critically and to stand by one's convictions. These lessons shaped his children's lives in ways beyond shooting. When his book Shots Fired in Anger was first published, it received moderate reviews. Some critics dismissed it as another war memoir, but among those who read it closely, especially soldiers and weapons enthusiasts, it gained a reputation as a treasure trove of insights. George's clear and candid evaluations of rifles, machine guns, and tactics were unlike anything else in print. Special Forces units passed dog-eared copies around and used his observations in training. When the book went out of print, demand grew, and copies became rare and valuable. Decades later, the National World War II Museum quoted him in exhibits about jungle warfare and sniping. His analysis of Japanese weapons influenced the development of American sniper training programs. His combination of technical detail and human narrative made his work stand out. He visited the museum where his Winchester was displayed. He stood quietly before the case. The rifle looked smaller than he remembered. Its wood was darker from age. The scope's finish was worn. On the placard, there was a brief description of its use on Guadalcanal. Nearby visitors chatted about tanks and planes. He felt a mix of detachment and pride. He reached out and touched the glass, then withdrew his hand. He wrote his name in the guest book and left a simple note. "Thank you for remembering." As he walked away, he thought of the men he had killed and those he had saved. He felt gratitude that the rifle would never again have to be used in anger. In later years, he became philosophical about the relationship between man and weapon. He wrote that technology amplifies human ability, but does not replace it. A good rifle makes a good shot better, but it cannot compensate for poor fundamentals. He argued that advances in sights and ballistics should not lead soldiers to neglect basic marksmanship. He compared a rifleman to an artisan whose skill determines the quality of the product. He saw parallels between blacksmiths hammering steel and shooters honing their craft. He believed that practice imbues simple materials with meaning. His thoughts influenced young shooters who saw him not just as a war hero, but as a mentor in craft. As he aged, he reflected on the lives of the Japanese snipers he had killed. He had read accounts of Japanese training, learning how they were taught to climb trees, to move silently, and to wait without complaint. He realized that they too had been sons, husbands, and fathers. They had taken pride in their skill. They had followed orders. They died far from home, in a jungle they likely found as oppressive as he did. He wished he could know their names. He hoped that somewhere in a village in Japan, someone told their stories. He believed that recognizing the humanity of the enemy did not lessen his own actions, but gave them context. War is a tragedy in which each death, no matter the side, diminishes us all. As the decades passed and the war receded into memory, the story of John George and his mail-order rifle became a footnote. Military historians focused on divisions and corps and on industrial output. They charted graphs of tonnage and manpower. In those narratives, the acts of one man seem small. Yet history is made of small acts that ripple outward. In a wet crater on Guadalcanal, one man with a bolt-action rifle looked up at the trees and decided to trust his training. He could have stayed under cover and waited for artillery. He could have conformed to the prevailing doctrine. Instead, he chose to confront an invisible enemy with patience and discipline. In doing so, he saved the men around him and taught his superiors to value individual skill. He also honored his opponents. When he wrote about them, he acknowledged their courage and suffering. He did not call them monsters. He recognized that they, too, were professionals who fought and died far from home. There is a tension between the logic of mass war and the logic of the rifleman. Mass war seeks to overwhelm with numbers, to produce more bullets and bodies than the enemy can withstand. It is a war of factories and supply lines. The rifleman values the perfect shot, the alignment of sight, picture, and breath, the quiet calculation of distance and wind. In modern war, these two logics collide. In the first phase of the Pacific Campaign, America deployed ships, planes, and divisions, yet the outcome of a company's advance could hinge on whether a sniper sat undiscovered in a palm tree. George's story reminds us that amid the roar of artillery and the rattle of machine guns, there is still a place for one man to take a breath, squeeze a trigger, and change the course of a fight. The conclusion of his story invites reflection. It is easy to celebrate the heroism of an individual and to ignore the system that enabled him. George had the resources to buy a rifle, the training from competitions, and the rank to defy skeptics. Many others could have done what he did if given the chance. He wrote that marksmanship was declining in the Army in 1941 and that few recruits could hit targets at 200 yards. He lamented that qualification standards were too lenient. His actions were an argument for investing in training. They were also a reminder that technology is only as good as the hands that wield it. A scope meant nothing if not used properly. A semi-automatic meant nothing if its user could not hit. At the end of his life, he saw museums and reenactors telling the story of World War II. They showed tanks, carriers, and jeeps. They told of generals and admirals. He knew that somewhere in a display case lay a wooden rifle with a worn grip and a modest scope. It had been mocked as a mail-order toy. It had been used to kill 11 snipers in 4 days. He knew that most who walked past it would never know its story. He accepted that. He had no desire for fame. Yet it matters that we remember. It matters because it reminds us that wars are fought by individuals, each making decisions under pressure. It matters because it challenges our assumptions about what counts as an effective weapon. It matters because in the industrial age, human skill can still alter events. On a humid January morning on Guadalcanal, a man lay in a ruined bunker, his cheek pressed to cold walnut. He had never killed another person. He had never heard the sound of a body striking branches on the way down. He breathed, squeezed, and fired. Everything that followed, the deaths, the lessons, the respect earned, and the debates about rifles, flowed from that moment. The story does not end with victory banners. It ends with quiet introspection. We are left with an image of a rifle in a glass case and a name that most will not recognize. We are left with the knowledge that for 4 days, on a forgotten ridge, the equation of war tilted because one man believed in his mail-order rifle.